Yo guys, what's up? This is the start of a new series we're going to do on this channel that I've decided to call Theorycraft Thursdays. It's going to be a lot of fun. Basically, once a week, we're going to go ahead and break down, the meta, talk about, what's better off this week, what's improved, what, the ramifications of any specific balanced patch notes are going to be. Now, I'm actually going to, I've improved on the format a little bit for this week, as I'm actually going to be starting with the last week meta report. This is not current, this is last week. And then I'm going to be showing you guys kind of like real-time adjustments and talking about, this deck is tier 1Y, this deck is tier 2Y as we go. And at this point, I should mention part of the reason that this particular video is late is because I was preparing in part for the Twitch Rivals sort of like triathlon tournament that I will be participating in. That is going to start next week, and that's going to involve like a Runeterra segment, a League of Legends, and a TFT. Now, a really big deal with these tournaments is, a lot of people will be kind of like taking strategies. When I did the other Twitch Rivals tournament for LoR, I was actually surprised how many of the participants literally just brought decks from my tier list on this site. I think at least 3 of them did, maybe 4. Were literally just using exact copies of decks that are only on my site. And so what that means is, like, because we have another one of those tournaments upcoming, I'm probably just going to add a bunch of like really bad decks to this site so that, I'll be able to trip up the competition. So keep that in mind. If you ever see something that doesn't look right here, that's probably why. But first things first, let's just go ahead and cover the balance patch. So there was a balance patch that launched today at time of recording on Wednesday. This patch had 2 soul notes. One was Kalinti Malar going to 3 Bedels instead of 2 Bedels. And the other one was Munzevi Kisis going all the way down to a really pitiful 3 Guk. So effectively here, this isn't really going to have a super large change on the metagame. Reasonably speaking, this kind of like these 2 patch notes, for the most part, Pilfered Goods isn't like a high-level meta card. It is something that is kind of like, psychologically frustrating to a lot of players, and it's not like it wasn't hitting competitive decks. The biggest competitive deck it was hitting was Twisted Fate Ezreal, and hey, this nerf does actually impact that deck. We'll talk about exactly what that means a little bit down the road. It was also run in some Tempo Sejuani variants, but for the most part, these decks weren't reliant on this card, so a lot of them will be cutting down on ratios of this card now, but for the most part, unchanged. And then we've got, the Solitaire Monk here, and this was run in really only 2 competitive decks. We saw it in Heimer Vi, of course, and we did see it in Elusive Burn, which is actually kind of a bit of a lesser choice, the Ionia Noxus Elusive Burn aggro archetype, but it actually did boast a really high place on the stats in that deck. So I would say that this nerf isn't going to change Heimer Vi literally at all. Versions will probably be running 2 Solitary Monks instead of 3. A 3/3 stat line is really powerful in this meta right now, especially against like the aggro decks. Most of them can't attack into a 3/3, so that's going to be all you really need this card for. I will say versions of Heimer Vi that were running 3 Monk might go down to 2 now, but I think you probably were supposed to be on 2 already anyway. So overall, the only high-tier decks that are actually getting hit by these 2 changes are Twisted Fate Ezreal and Elusive Burn. Okay, now let's go ahead and look at last week's snapshot, as we can see here, and we're going to talk about like where different decks are at, like what's moving up and down. So the first thing is that Kinko Elusives is going to get bumped down to tier 2 here. The biggest thing, unfortunately, is that Kinko Elusives is kind of like caught in a bad meta for it right now. Most of the aggro decks are just kind of like rushing it down a little too fast. Elusives is really an anti-mid-range archetype, and they excel basically at just like going toe-to-toe with mid-range decks, some forms of control decks, and just being able to kill them without being stopped. Aggro is always going to have the resources to race down Kinko Elusives, so even a deck like Elusive Burn, the more aggressive form of Elusives, is going to be more so in line with what you want in this meta. And we're going to go ahead and move that up in the Kinko Elusive's place. Elusive Burn comes in at a pretty high win rate. We're going to talk about the individual decks afterwards, but here we're just talking about how the meta has progressed in the last week. I say week, but it's been 10 days since I made one of these videos, since it's Thursday. Okay, next up, Ezreal Tef is going to go ahead and get donked down to tier 2. Honestly, tier 2 is honestly, possibly even a little bit generous here. Ezreal has lost a ton of stats, the biggest reason of which being is that mostly this was a deck that was feeding off of Heimer Vi, when Heimer Vi was kind of like more so blowing up in popularity. Now there's a lot more aggro, there's less Heimer Vi, and Ezreal TF has lost a lot of his surprise factor. Combine that with the fact that, you know, Pilfered Goods goes to 3 mana, which does actually affect Ezreal Vi. So that's going to go ahead and get bumped down to tier 2. Next, we've got the Basilisk Spiders, or like Riders Nox aggro, going up to tier 1. And here I'm actually going to split it into 2 different versions. There's 2 common second regions here, the first of which being the Harrowing version, that is more common right now, and the second of which being the Freljord Splash, which actually is less common, but it does come with pretty solid stats, and I've been kind of like experimenting and tweaking it. Ultimately, it's just going to have slightly different matchups. Normally, I won't list different variations on my tier list. Normally, I'll kind of list one variation, but in this case, it's the most common meta deck right now, and these 2 variations will actually generate fairly significantly different matchups. So I think splitting it into these 2 different decks is actually going to be pretty important for the meta right now. The biggest thing you have to understand in terms of, like, you know, which Basilisk deck you might want to play, just to go over it here, is that with the Harrowing version, you're going to be better against, like, the non-Ionia things, the Twisted Fate Ezreals. You're going to be against better against like the Bilgewater Sejuani style decks. That's going to be pretty big. Overall, you are going to be a bit weaker in the Mirror, and you are going to be a bit weaker as well to something like Braum and Nivea, where you're definitely going to have better value going for like Fury of the North, because Harrowing, unfortunately, against a good Braum and Nivea player, will kind of like almost always never represent too much kill potential, really. And then finally, and this is going to be the final change for the time being, Yoink Sejuani is going to get back to the Tempo Sejuani version. The biggest difference here is that Yoink Sejuani plays for Black Market Merchant and Pilfered Goods. It's a bit slower of a deck. Tempo Sejuani plays for really like aggressive, like triple Island Navigator, triple Razor Scale Hunter, basically kind of like blowing opponent out early. Is going to be a lot better, not just because Pilfered Goods got nerfed, but also because right now that's where you want to be in the metagame, right? You want to be threatening the like control decks with the Fury on your double attackers, and you want to be making sure you can beat up aggro decks by threatening stuff like Sejuani is an amazing counter to like Darius. If they play Darius and use Sejuani, it's nuts. Reasonably speaking, you know, it's just much better positioned in this meta. And you'll have noticed on this tier list, the Sejuani Bilgewater version has actually, in the past like 5 or 6 weeks, it's gone between Yoink and Tempo versions actually several different times now, just based on kind of like what's better for that specific week. And right now, the Tempo version is definitely going to be better. And that's probably not going to change for a while, mostly due to the Pilfered Goods nerf. However, this is also going to be a tier 1 deck, and that might surprise some of you guys, especially because it doesn't have an amazing play rate. But we're going to actually dive into the stats and talk about why this is actually going to be a tier 1 deck for the time being. So all in all, not too bad. We actually end up with, well, I wouldn't say a very diverse tier 1, because it does have like sort of limited kind of like archetype and region representation, but there are probably more options than a lot of people had in mind. That is kind of like the brief rundown of kind of like last week to this week. And now we'll go deck by deck and talk about the stats. I'm going to start kind of like doing this every week, where I kind of like just show you guys how things have specifically changed from last week to this one. Honestly, it just makes sense. I don't really know why I haven't been doing it like that. It's really just makes sense. Okay, and now that we've got that done, let's go ahead and get into the actual list. So here I'm going to be going through decks in order, breaking down all the tier 1 and tier 2 decks on the site. I'm not going to be talking about tier 3 decks because of course they tend to be like less important, but you know, there's still decks that are solid and somewhat recommendable. Like, you still will be able to get wins with them. There's nothing really wrong with playing them. And if you want to check them out, you can definitely head to the site. Just won't be mentioning them here. All right. So let's go ahead and get started, kind of at no particular place at the top. So again, we're just going to be breaking down each of these decks, talking about cards and talking about the stats and kind of like where each deck is at. So Basilisk aggro, as I mentioned before, is coming in a couple of different versions. Now I'm realizing my screen is cropped, unfortunately, and you guys aren't able to see the two Katos in this list. I rectified that. Pretty straightforward. This is going to be your Freljord version of the Basilisk aggro. Now Basilisk aggro is an archetype that comes in at a pretty ridiculous 59% win rate across like a really high sample size. Now, this is mostly harrowing versions. Freljord comes in with a much lower sample size at 57% win rate, but the Freljord versions being played are actually quite a bit different from this one, which should end up a large amount above the 57. So overall, how this version is going to differ from the harrowing, well, it's going to be better into the mirrors, it's going to be better against the Ionia decks, it's going to be better against most of the PNZ decks, and it's going to be better against the Brahmanivia decks. Now, where its shortcoming is going to be mostly like mid-range matchups where the harrowing ends up being pretty essential as your win condition. Alright, so the big thing about this deck, it's not running Ruthless Raider, which actually might look a little bit surprising because Ruthless Raider is a really powerful card and also combines with Omen Hawk and Fury of the North quite well. The biggest thing though is it just ends up being pretty unnecessary for this deck. You don't really need a powerful turn 2 play, and mostly you just want to be making sure you have a decent turn 1 play. The single biggest draw to Omen Hawk in this deck over the Shadow Isles version is that SI doesn't provide a powerful 1-drop. And the Shadow Isles version is therefore forced to very awkwardly run Legion Saboteur, which I've actually cut down to a 2 of in this version, as you can see. But even so, I think this card is actually like really horrible in this current meta. I think it loses a crazy amount of games. So, just to describe a scenario, if you are in the mirror, one person's on the Freljord version and one person's on the Shadow Isles version, if turn 1 goes Omen Hawk into Saboteur, the game is already really one-sided. Like, the Saboteur will just trade with the Omen Hawk, and one player will have like 2 +1/+1 buffs, and that's a really crazy advantage, right? Basically, the meta just has too many like small blockers and too many ways of punishing like committal 1 health stat lines. So that's really the single biggest value that Freljord version gets over the like harrowing version. Just this card here. Fury of the North is a really great counter to most of like the Shadow Isles concepts. It's a big counter to a lot of the, anything like moving in for removal. It allows you to beat a lot of like the grasps and the whales, which in turn allows you to beat the ruination, because you're never really playing around the ruination as to disable it, but to force it into like a lower range of value. And eventually, it'll just end up empowering the grasps and the whales that the Fury of the North is in turn beating, right? So it kind of counters the whole package there. And that's most of what you're getting. Now, you'll notice both of my versions are running Arachnoid Sentry. I think this is a pretty integral card right now. You should not be playing a Basilisk Rider deck without one Arachnoid Sentry at least. Trust me on this. Add one to your Basilisk Rider deck. It will win you so many like mirror matches. It will hit so many positions like Stunning Braum and stuff. When your opponent plays Rider on 4 and you Sentry, you turn the game in a mirror match. You turn the game from a basically like almost like unwinnable, terribly behind position into actually pretty good. So Sentry is just amazing right now. Alright, so lastly we're going to make one really important note with the entire like Basilisk Rider archetype as a whole, and that is going to be that the viability and tiering of this is actually going to largely depend on which region you're playing on. And this is actually something that I haven't touched on much in my Meta Mondays videos before. I have mentioned this a few times on my stream on Twitch, but for the most part, the different region ladders will actually have somewhat different metagames. And right now, I don't have access to different region stats. I don't believe Mobalytics is currently able to differentiate between regions, or at least there isn't a feature for that. I might talk to them about setting something like that up. I did mention it in the past. And the biggest byproduct of this, and this is based on somewhat my anecdotal experience, but a lot of people agreeing with this, my interpretation of the ladder is effectively that the EU ladder is much more kind of control-oriented. I believe you're going to see a much higher degree of Brahmanivia decks on the EU ladder. And from what I've seen, just from my personal experience, which is never going to be a super high sample size, it's always anecdotal statistics, but from what I've seen and from what other people have told me, there's enough Braum Anivia on the EU ladder that Basilisk aggro on EU might actually be a tier 2 deck, whereas this is absolutely a tier 1 deck on the NA ladder. So a bit of food for thought, and keep in mind that this pattern is kind of always going to be present to different degrees. You are going to see EU ladders more like kind of control oriented, and you are going to see NA ladders a bit more aggro oriented. I actually find this pretty fascinating because there actually have been some studies about like how Americans and Europeans like tackle problem solving, and Americans have been shown to be more like trial and error, whereas Europeans have been more like sort of like planning oriented. And it's very, very interesting how we see these like cultural mentalities being applied to like different ladder environments. I believe this is like a very recurring trend across like card games as a whole, actually. Anyway, next up we've got the elusive burn aggro archetype. This is actually a somewhat underrepresented one. I think this is a deceptively difficult list to play, but nonetheless, it does come in the stats with a very high 58% win rate. What you're seeing here is my version, currently on the highest win rate, a bit above, it's at 59 right now. And the only change I've made in the last 10 days is swapping the Elixir of Wrath for a Brothers Bond. Again, I'm going to caution that, very similar to the Basilisk Rider, this deck is going to get much better results on the NA ladder than the EU ladder, which is pretty interesting, man. It's really like, depending on some metas, it might be like very difficult to have like universal tier lists because of that. Like, it's really difficult for me to make two different tier lists for the different ladder regions, but it is a pretty big factor here because as high of a win rate as this deck does have, its Braum and Nivea matchup is going to be one of the weaker ones for the most part. Also, as mentioned before, the Solitary Monk nerf hits this deck the hardest, much harder than Heimer Vi. So even though this does have a very good win rate right now, it is possible that the stats will show the Solitary Monk nerf being a higher impact than anyone suspected. I doubt we'll see like a huge reduction though. Then we've got Braum Anivia. This is kind of like the control deck of the meta. This is the Shadow Isles plus X of this patch. And this is my current version of it. Not a lot has changed, just a couple of independent swaps. I'm still not a huge fan of Hapless Aristocrat in the meta. It can be a big blowout in some of the early positions and some of the variations of the decks, but I don't like it as more than a 2F here because it can really, really just completely hold you back in like slower matchups like Mirrors. It's a complete dead draw. So you really don't want to like overcommit into your aggro matchup where you're already quite favored. This is an archetype that currently has a 57% win rate across ladder. Pretty great, pretty high. It is certainly, for like the current meta, going to be a tier 1 deck. It's a great way to beat, like really, really target down these like Noxus aggro decks. It is incredibly difficult for Noxus aggro to win into this matchup as long as you don't have like the worst hand ever. Kindly Tavern Keeper in particular is like an absolutely ridiculous counter to Nox aggro. This card is everything that you could possibly want against an aggro deck. The really biggest thing being that it doesn't really set you back on tempo. A lot of people look at aggro with the idea of, oh, I should gain health against aggro. Really, that can in some cases even be backwards, because gaining health is usually a slow thing, and you need to be stabilizing and controlling the board against aggro while not overpaying in mana. Not only does Tavern Keeper heal you for 3, but on turn 3 it hits the board as a 3/3. And in this current meta, the 3/3 stat line is king. It is hard to explain how insanely big the 3/3 stat line is right now in this meta. It is ridiculous. On turn 3, if you play a 3/3, you counter everything that aggro does. You're able to trade into Ballista, you're able to stop Precious Pets from attacking, Crimson Disciples from attacking, you're able to do almost anything. Usually, you know, the Grenadier already can't attack because you have a blocker, and they might have a Draven attack, but this stat line and this heal just goes incredibly far in that matchup. making it pretty one-sided. The only way they can really do big things is if they have Harrowing, and if you save Ruination for Harrowing, that's going to make that really awkward. So enter like the Fury of the North Basilisk version to try to be able to like keep threats alive outside of ranges on Whale, and that is where, you know, that version has a bit more of a chance against this. Now, where this deck ends up coming a little bit shorter is, of course, against like a combo deck. As we can see, you know, it's always going to be a pretty standard triangle. I've actually kind of like whipped up a version on the site that's like hopefully going to really help identify and talk about like how this like aggro triangle tends to work. But again, we see combo beats control, control beats aggro, and aggro beats combo, right? And this is like the general trend we're always going to see. So of course, this is a heavy control deck. It will absolutely smash aggro decks, but it will always get countered by, you know, decks of the combo archetype. And that's going to be, you know, a lot of the things, like, for example, Heimervi ends up going pretty decent with it toe-to-toe. It's actually, like, pretty close. Ezreal TF also has a solid win rate into Braumanivia, although that actually has gotten a little bit worse in the last week. All right, next up we've got Tempo Sejuani. Tempo Sejuani is actually an incredibly well-positioned deck in the meta right now. You're looking at my current version. So Tempo Sejuani, a very different deck from Yoink Sejuani. Well, I say very different. You know, I mean, they do run like 25 to 30 of the same cards, but for the most part, they do operate under pretty different play patterns, and it is very important to, you know, acknowledge like the amount of different matchup tables you're able to generate with like a 10 card swap like that is a lot bigger than I think it seems. So I really do think a lot of players make the mistake of like sort of categorizing these as the same deck when they're very different. This is Tempo Sejuani, and unlike the Yoink package here, we are operating very aggressive. We're trying to burst things down. Mostly we're using scouts like Island Navigator and Razor Scale Hunter that have the ability to threaten a good board presence. On occasion, you can threaten a Misfortune Flip. And in a big way, if you Fury on like a double attacker, you can absolutely power down a lot of the control decks that otherwise are potentially really, really, really scary to get through. Kind of like one of the single biggest combos you have for that reason. So the reason that this deck is very well positioned, well, I guess I should say the tempo version of this deck is coming in with a 58% win rate. Now that is over a bit under 1,000 games, but it's still in the statistically relevant range, so fairly small sample size, but definitely a high enough win rate to get my attention, and it is incredibly well positioned in the meta. So what do I mean by that? Well, against the Noxus aggro decks, you tend to end up favored against like most variants. You have a lot of like the best counters for what you want at any given like step of the way. You know, you can kind of go toe to toe with their board. You have a lot of like potential trade options into stuff like the Basilisk Rider. You've got your Sejuani to counter Darius on 6. You've got stuff like, you know, early game blockers, as well as like Make It Rain Parlay that can sometimes have like really, really great early removal value. For the most part, it does totally fine into Basilisk Rider. Harrowing being kind of, the Harrowing version is kind of definitely a lot better against this version, because Harrowing is the one card you can't really answer. Now, if you're against something like Braumanivia, well, you're going to be a lot better than most options as well. You know, it's a tempo deck that has the ability to power the opponent down very quickly while kind of like playing for efficient defense. Basically, it's kind of like a very, very, very flexible deck. And in this meta, that's exactly what you want to be. So not only is this able to power down a deck like Braumanivia quickly enough, but it's able to sustain against the aggressive decks and potentially kind of like, you know, hit them with a bit of over the top, racing them down. And that's great. That's going to earn my spot on the tier 1 list this week for sure. I think that there's a lot of people that are under the impression that just because there's no patch notes that are of like real relevance that the meta can't really shift. And that's definitely not true. There still will be like pretty major shifts to the meta. And I think this is one of them. Tempo Sejuani is a deck right now, like Freljord is pretty well positioned. Tempo Sejuani is a solid deck. It could end up being top of tier 2 like next week or something like that. But I think that we're going to see this deck get a lot more attention. Why is that, you might ask? Well, honestly, a really big factor is simply the fact that Pilfered Goods got nerfed. Which is to say that because a lot of less people are going to be playing like Nab Sejuani, a lot more people are going to, experiment going back to this version. And right now, in the current meta, the Nab version is actually really, really, really punished, and this version is really, really, really rewarded. So people will very, very quickly figure out that this version is kind of like what you want to be playing off of the Pilfered Goods nerf, which was true before Pilfered Goods ended up getting nerfed. Like from the meta shift, like in the last like 7 days or so, this deck has been much better than the Nab version. And I think people will be figuring that out and abusing it. Anyway, one point about how the meta takes a turn is we can talk about Heimer Vi. Now, Heimer Vi came on to be kind of like, the most sort of like OP and oppressive deck very early on. It was stopping a lot of strategies dead, but as versions of decks became more and more refined, Heimer Vi did start to fall off, and its win rate is not amazing right now. It's pretty good. It still hits like, potential tier 1 range. It does, kind of depend on exactly how we're evaluating it at that point. But in all ranks, Heimer Vi's win rate is currently 55%, which should be like, from just the pure win rate metric at tier 2 win rate. In Masters, it ends up a little bit higher at like 56 to 57, but still not actually that high. A couple of weeks before, it was hitting 60% in Masters pretty reliably. So what's changed? Well, the biggest thing is that Braum and Nivea has kind of like gotten to the point where it's been able to move away from being a pure control deck and kind of like migrate into the combo territory. And it does that by adding in one simple card, which is the Harrowing. This card alone, and sometimes, it does obviously in this matchup get denied, and that can be pretty big when it happens. But this card alone means that instead of being pure control, this deck does have the ability to actually have some like real pressure threat that the opponent must answer. And that's a really, really big deal, because if they don't have deny, they can often get entirely overpowered by it here, right? And that is kind of where Heimer Vi starts to fall off, where, it's meant to counter these control decks, but when the control decks are starting to enable like some of their own combo options, then it loses a little bit of value. On top of that, the aggro decks are at this point very, very efficient, much more streamlined than they were at the start of the patch. Like when Basilisk Rider got buffed, this would have been, like 3 weeks ago, reasonably speaking at this point. And, almost 3 weeks ago. And in that 2.5 weeks, I guess, the decks have just gotten more and more refined. They're going to keep getting more and more refined. That actually will not stop. And I will say this right now, Heimer Vi, I'm pretty sure won't be tier 1 in the next update. The next meta update, the next meta Mondays. When I do this on Monday, which, could be 5 days from now for all we know, who knows. But I don't think Heimer Vi has like a long-term position in tier 1. It's still a very powerful deck, and a deck that has a lot of like unhealthy, implications on the potential metagame. But in terms of its own ability to close out games and its own ability to survive in this metagame, its biggest flaw is that it is fundamentally unadaptable. It can't go with the flow. It can't change as changes are happening. This is an incredibly rigid deck build that you couldn't change if you wanted to, really. Maybe you can cut the solitary monks and try to add in like a few like semi-flexible options. Maybe a third deny you could say might help the current metagame, but it's never going to be enough. You're never going to be able to have the flexible build that both the control and the aggro decks are representing at this point in time, right? And both of those decks, I can tell you right now, both Basilisk aggro and like Braum and Nivea control, both of those decks are going to keep getting better week to week. Look at this. Like it's such a big deal. Last updated 10 days ago. This is a deck that can't really change. It's stuck. And in being stuck, every other deck is getting better week to week. And in being stuck, this deck just ends up, unfortunately, falling behind. So that's the story of Heimer Vi. Now, I haven't moved it from tier 1 quite yet, because of course it is still a very powerful deck. It is a deck that does demand a pretty high skill ceiling, so you know there will still be a lot of people playing it, and there will still be a lot of people winning with it. And I do want to give it one more week before I do demote it to tier 2, because things could easily turn around. You know, it has been a very long-term tier 1 deck for a while, so you know I don't want to be too hasty about donking it to tier 2, but that is kind of like where my head is at right now. And we'll have to see. I know a lot of you guys would be very glad if that happened. All right, and that's going to go ahead and finish up tier 1 for us here. So what we're left with is effectively a very, very, very fast metagame, right? You've got all of these kind of like Nox aggro versions. You've got, you know, the control deck of the meta, the Shadow Isles plus X of the meta, which is Braum and Nivea in this case. And then, of course, your Sejuani version is leaning about as aggressive as it possibly could, going into like the full tempo version. All right, so tier 2. Of course, these are still going to be pretty powerful decks. Misfortune aggro, let's get into it. This deck actually hasn't changed in the past week, but has still been able to uphold pretty good stats. Now, this is my version of the deck, and I will basically, usually when I make versions of things, I'll always be changing them week to week. Every week I do these meta reports. I'm always going through the stats for the archetype and basically looking at any potential like variation indications of like something getting better or worse. And if there is, you know, something that's going to be, you know, a slightly higher variation, or a card that ends up like boosting the win rate, depending on kind of like the card in question, I might make a bit of a change. So when you look here, when there's a deck on the site, this says updated 10 days ago. I haven't updated it. The reason I haven't updated it is because this is the version that comes in with the highest win rate, actually by a really, really high margin already, which is brilliant. I love it when that happens. It's very convenient, because of course it just means I don't have to change anything. This is the version. It's not like a mind-blowing version. I'm not going to say, oh God, my version of Misfortune Scouts is so much smarter than anyone else's. It's Scouts. There's like literally 2 cards you can change out of it. But in this case, I'm really liking the exact ratioing we have. The 2 Senna combined with a 3 Illusion means you're never like as awkward on like the double draws when you don't want them. You know, you have the 2 single combat, the 2 repost, the 2 relentless pursuit, making sure we're able to be a bit flexible while not double drawing things that we really can't afford to be double drawing. And of course the 3 Genevieve Elmhart. This card was really, really, really massively buffed. Now, this version does come in at a 59% win rate. Actually, where were the win rates here? Hang on, let me pull this up. So this is the version that comes in. Oh, sorry, not 59. It's actually 58. And then there's a couple of other versions that come in a little bit lower, a little bit all over the place. So it depends kind of like how we're averaging this up. But average would be like 55 here, because this 53 is like weighted really heavily on the 2600 matchups. You'd call this like a 55% win rate overall, which is solid, and that's why it ends up being still a tier 2 deck. It's a great, solid, like aggro archetype. It's gonna do pretty well into the meta. You know, you will be able to win a lot of matchups, but it does not have the stuff to be a tier 1 deck right now, and I don't see that changing. Okay, then we've got Burn Aggro. I don't even know why I'm still like mentioning Burn Aggro every week. It's like nothing ever really changes with this deck. It's not a deck that experiences like any form of change. It's still going to have like the same kind of tier 2 win rate as it's had in the past. It's still going to have like a really high play rate over here because it's a cheap and easy deck, and you know it generates fast games, which is nice. And it still hasn't changed a single card in literally like a month and a half. But I mean, it's still a decent deck. It's always hitting a solid win rate. It's never really hitting below the win rate. Honestly, I'm just going to stop mentioning it in these, though. It's like the deck never changes a single card. It never changes a single tier since they got nerfed that one time. Since Boom Crew went to 3 health, it was a tier 2 deck. And then it's never going to... Its win rate's not really going to go up or down. I mean, Why even mention it? I'll keep it on the tier list. I'm just gonna stop mentioning burn aggro. Now, Kinko Elusives, however, is a deck that has fallen really from grace here, right? I mean, a couple of weeks ago, it was the deck that we were like holding #1 on ladder with for quite some time. It was really good at that period of time, but as things went on, as like there was like the surge of like Viheimer, it was doing really well against a lot of the weaker forms of Braumanivia, but those decks were able to like fairly quickly improve. And the same was true with like the Noxus aggro decks as well, which have gotten a lot more refined over the past like 2 or 3 weeks, to the point where they just end up keeping this archetype down. Kinko Elusives as an archetype comes in with, quite sadly, a 54% win rate, a shell of its former self, and my version actually comes in a bit lower than that, 53% win rate. I'd love to blame, regression to the mean, since it's like a higher play rate, but I mean, reasonably speaking, it's not like I'm not gonna mention when my version has like a slightly lower win rate. Overall, in the metagame, this is just not well enough positioned, right? Like, Basilisk Rider is just too, or not the card, but just the Noxus aggro in general ends up being like too big of a counter for this deck, because they just can't race that deck down quite fast enough. You can, it's not like unlosable. You're only minorly favored, but the problem is that matchup is so common right now, at the very least on the NA ladder. The matchup is so incredibly common right now that even though it's like it's above 40%, it's like somewhere between 40 and 45, it still ends up being enough to hold this deck back. At the end of the day, there's not really major changes this deck is really able to make. Elusives are still a fairly powerful concept right now, but they are better off like going more aggressive, skewing into like the Noxus tools. And Omen Hawk and Fear of the North are very powerful right now, but you really want to be combining them with one of a couple of other decks. So overall, this one ends up being tier 2 for the time being. Now, Ezreal Twisted Fate is a deck that has gotten pretty shafted here. It was originally constructed as an anti-meta deck to the like very, very specific top level meta, and it was super popular for like 3 days at the top of like Master's Ladder because it was able to counter a lot that was going on in the metagame at the time. From then, it has donked off a ridiculous win rate and is now struggling at a 52% win rate, which is, reasonably speaking, a tier 3 win rate. It is a deck that can perform even lower off of the Pilfered Goods nerf as well. As we can see in this version, we have cut out the Pilfered Goods. It is, not quite worth running in this anymore at 3 mana. It was never super integral to the game plan. For the most point, this is kind of like a tempo flex deck that blows out big with like a Riptide or Ezreal finisher in the late game, right? It never really necessarily needed the Pilfered Goods, but it's certainly something it doesn't want to see gone. However, we're still running Black Market Merchant. Now, there are going to be different versions of this being experimented on. The Pilfered Goods just got nerfed. Different people are somewhat disagreeing about how to actually go about that. You can make an argument to keep 3 Pilfered Goods in a deck like this. You can make an argument to keep 1 or 2, and you can make an argument to cut it completely. And then lastly, you can make the argument to cut Pilfered Goods completely and Black Market Merchant along with it. We've chosen option number 3 here, going with a Merchant, no Pilfered Goods, and time will show like which option is best. But overall, Ezreal Twisted Fate does end up a deck that doesn't quite do well enough against the current meta at the moment. The biggest issue with the deck right now is like the resurgence of the aggro decks. This was a deck that it was just an anti-meta deck for a short period of time. Basically, the way the meta has evolved is right off the gate for about the first like 7 days of the ladder reset, it was incredibly aggro heavy. The biggest reason for that being A, people want to climb fast, get back to Masters, but B, Basilisk Rider is one of the newly changed cards, as well as even Darius, although his buff didn't change too much. Reasonably speaking, that just kind of like pushes a lot of people into the archetype. Then at that point, like things shifted very, very heavily into control and combo. the Brown Manivia decks were starting to get, you know, a lot more refined, and they were like keeping the aggro decks away a little bit. But what ended up happening is we're at the stage now where there were a lot of decks to come in to beat, you know, these control decks. It was like the Heimerdinger deck like made a huge resurgence to beat Brown Manivia, and then you saw decks like Ezreal Twisted Fate. This is where this deck enters, right? This deck entered for a couple of days there when aggro was cleared out, and when, you know, there was a lot of Brown Manivia and a lot of Heimer trying to counter the Brown Manivia at the time, which is debatable if it can even do that anymore. And this deck hit that meta hard because aggro wasn't really prevalent in that small gap, and it happened to not only be good against Heimer Vi, but also good against like the Brown Manivias of the time, or at least pretty reasonably solid against them. And overall, I don't think this was ever going to be like a long-term meta-stable deck. It probably won't end up being tier 2 on the list for the next week, although I do want to make sure that these stats coming in the last week weren't, you know, a bit of a fluke or anything like that, because they didn't have like amazingly high sample size. Overall, though, it's important to kind of like think about like how this deck worked out and why it was seeing play, and why a lot of people were saying it was a super good deck. Right, we even had it listed as tier S for a little bit of time because of that, right? But yeah, overall, definitely this deck isn't really an Ezreal deck. It's important to note that. It's a tempo deck that uses like Riptide and Ezreal as finishers. Reasonably speaking, like Ezreal is... And this is how good Ezreal decks operate, by the way. Good Ezreal decks, for most of Runeterra's history, there have been a couple exceptions, but usually a good Ezreal deck is just something that uses Ezreal as a finisher and isn't really dependent on him. He's like a really good Decimate in this deck, basically, right? That's kind of like all he really is or needs to be. The deck mostly just wants to like kind of like own the board and make sure we're getting Riptide value later, is usually how this deck is going to be operating and winning games. All right, and that brings us down to Keg Control and Tempo Endure. Keg Control is an archetype that hasn't actually really seen major changes or a ton of play. Mostly this has gotten phased out by Brown Manivia, which is just a better version of the Shadow Isles concept. It comes in with a 55% win rate, which puts it exactly on the same level as Deep, which of course is an easy comparison because they're both Shadow Isles, Bilgewater, and end up using a lot of the same cards. I actually think that this deck or this archetype is better positioned in the meta than a pure Deep deck, because you do have a lot more kind of like early game answers and a lot less like, you know, commitment into the late game option of sea monsters. So I do actually end up liking where this version is at. I think it's a solid list, and it needs to be perhaps like rebuilt, the idea of Bilgewater Shadow Isles. I actually think that there's some pretty solid deck in Bilgewater Shadow Isles that people aren't really playing, and I don't know if I can say exactly what it would look like, but it would look closer to this than it would to Deep. Overall, I'm going to keep it on the tier list for now. It's a fairly fun and unique deck, especially if you want to play, you know, a control deck that's not using, you know, the Brown Manivia, because there is a lot of that going around right now. I really like, you know, just the idea of kegs. It leads to a very fun and unique playstyle that I find rewarding, so I'm not going to be, you know, entirely dismissing this anytime soon. Maybe I'll end up coming back to the concept and seeing if we can make something a lot stronger out of it. Next up, we've got Tempo Endure. I actually don't know what the Tempo Endure win rate is off the top of my head. That's one that I actually am going to have to pull up. Tempo Endure. Man, yeah, 55. That's actually a bit higher than it was last time I checked. It was at like 54 before. And these are going to be kind of like, you know, the most stable common versions. This is like the non-hapless 2 Fury 2 Haunted, which is one of my versions. I don't know if it's... Yeah, it's my current version. Okay, at 55%. So, yep, right within like tier 2 range. It's a deck that, God, honestly, I have not seen this since the patch. And, you know, I mean, no surprises there. It's not even that it got so much worse, but it is a deck that was so incredibly common before the patch like 3 weeks ago that I think everyone was just a little bit sick of it. it might see like some minor resurgences there. But at the end of the day, They Who Endure going to 7 mana is, I think, a much bigger deal than people gave it credit for in this list, right? Like, it's pretty huge. And it really goes to show, like, when 1 mana just makes a difference. You would really think it wouldn't. Same with when Karma got nerfed from 5 mana to 6 mana. But 1 mana can, man, make just such a huge difference. What I will say is where this deck's real strength lies in being kind of like the most optimal Callista list. And I do think that right now, a well-built Callista sort of like aggressive style list can actually be very, very well positioned and have like high potential in the metagame right now. I think that you might not want to be doing it with, a They Who Endure deck anymore. There might be a different way to build an all-in Callista list, but this is probably the strongest champion that's not really currently been utilized by the meta decks at the time. And then finally, to close out the list, we've got our deep deck. Now, this is a deep deck that hasn't really changed too much from like past versions, but is pretty tailored to the current very aggressive meta right now. And we see that with basically the 1 hired gun, help a little bit of early stabilization, and the 3 thorny toads. Thorny toad is usually not a big grab for deep decks in the past, but in the current format with a lot of aggro and a lot of overwhelm in general, this card actually is quite good in the current meta, which is fairly funny. For the most part, I don't think deep is really a great archetype, honestly. I think that it's lacking a lot in terms of where the deck wants to be at and where the deck really wants to be winning. So I will say that it's always going to have a solid win rate. It's winning all the same games that Shadow Isles would, but I don't think I can really openly, advise the deck. Really, in my mind, it's a tier 3 deck, really. I think it kind of always has been. I've never really been a huge fan of deep. It's always been very kind of like incoherent as a concept and just ends up being sort of a fairly suboptimal form of Shadow Isles plus X, right? The deck does get a couple of places. The biggest thing about the deck is that you do have the ability to, in this current meta, usually be beating Braum and Nivea. And that's really, really impactful when you can have a good win rate against that. But unfortunately, even though we have a lot of reactive cards and a lot of healing, we're still not going to end up favored enough against something like an optimized Nox aggro deck in the current meta. There's just not going to be enough here for that without running stuff like the Kindly Tavern Keeper. I mean, that's why the Braum deck has the big advantage there, right? Which this deck doesn't have. So unfortunately, it is going to be a little bit lower on the list, but it's able to really counter these Braum and Niveas. So, if you're playing maybe EU ladder, you're seeing a lot more Braum and Niveas, you're looking for a counter deck, well, this is a pretty good one. This is going to be kind of like your go-to deck to beat that. Now, Sea Monsters does kind of blur the lines between combo and control, because it's got it's got a lot of control pieces and it's got a lot of combo pieces. But overall, I do think it tends more towards the combo concept, and that's exactly why it ends up favored against Braum and Nivea, right? Combo beats control. So it's actually got a pretty decent role in the meta because of that. But overall, similar to Heimer Vi, it's a little too rigid of a deck just because it has so many dedicated slots. It's pretty hard to change as it needs to change. And that's the biggest issue with the deck right now. You'd love to take a concept that's favored against, Braum and Nivea and try to tweak it to make more sense in the current meta. But unfortunately, deep isn't tweakable enough for that. So that's this meta in a nutshell. We actually have pretty decent representation. A lot of decks hitting pretty high tier 1 win rates. Overall, nothing really too new or fancy, as we might expect. The last balanced patch notes, it's no big secrets that they're not really going to change too much of anything on their surface level. However, I will, make the point, and this is really, really important to understand, that reasonably speaking, the meta will make big shifts without patch notes, right? More than one might imagine, right? I think the last thing I'll leave you guys with is that the metagame, and this is true for a lot of games, but more so true for this game at the current time, is very, very unsolved. The metagame is super unsolved to the point where I can guarantee you there's very high level decks that just kind of aren't being run right now, but should be being run, as well as decks that are currently like tier 1 are actually like built fairly suboptimally, right? And there's a lot of like, it just takes time and, you know, community engagement to improve these things, right? So even if there aren't really going to be patches, as we can see, there wasn't really a balance update in the past 10 days. There was one extremely minor one with Pilfered Goods and Solitaire Monk. But even given that, the meta has shifted a ton in the past 10 days, right? We can see how a lot of these things have changed, and a lot more is going to change next up, right? Like I said, Heimervi is almost certainly about to be a tier 2 deck, or at least that would be my take on it. So I would say that it's a absolute mistake to feel too constrained by the meta or too defeated by it. There's always going to be, and really right now there's a ton of room for ingenuity and for the meta to move forward, right? And you guys will see that for sure over the next couple of weeks, decks advancing in ways that might surprise a lot of you guys. In fact, I've got some pretty good ideas for my boys in the Twitch Rivals tournament. So we'll have to see exactly what I'm able to come up with there. But I'm going to be experimenting. That's going to be a week from now. So I'm going to be experimenting a lot more over the next week, trying to find these sorts of optimizations that I've been kind of like attempting in the past somewhat, and to varying degrees of motivation. And, you know, I mean, I'm a little burnt out on the patch, but I think that there's still a lot to figure out for sure. And I think that figuring out some like powerful decks for that tournament is a really big motivator for me to really try hard in the next week on optimization. All right, but that is it for me. It is 1:00 a.m. so I'm gonna go ahead and have to end it now, and I'll see you guys next time.